name's Kim Warnick. I use the pronouns she and her. And if you want to drop a hello in the chat and sort of like let us know where you're tuning in from, you're very welcome to do that. If you're in the Zoom meeting or on Facebook and want to add your name and where you're coming from in the comments, that's great too. So I'm the executive director at Calling All Crows. We're a nonprofit that works in the music industry. So we were founded by a musician and a tour manager and work on different issues that impact women and girls in our communities. The reason I'm here today to talk to you about sexual violence is that I have a background in sexual violence. I've been doing this work for about a decade, both on the prevention and the response side. And sorry, if you keep seeing me like bounce around, because people are still being admitted in, so I'm getting distracted by dinging bells. So I've been doing this work for about a decade, prevention and response work. I work more on the prevention side, but I am a trained crisis counselor and have done work in sort of like the immediate aftermath of sexual violence in the crisis mode. And a lot of the work I've focused on recently has been in sexual violence in the workplace and then specifically in the music industry. So Calling All Crows has a campaign called Here for the Music that focuses on preventing sexual violence at shows and at festivals. So we're focused more on the live music aspect of it and really thinking about all of the people who come together to make a live event possible. But during this training, you'll hear things that are applicable beyond live music. So it's not just the live shows, but really sexual harassment more broadly than that. So I'm gonna share my screen now so that you can sort of see and follow along with what I'm doing. Let me know if you can see that. Carrie, can you see that? Okay, perfect, thank you. So what we're gonna do today is talk about like what is sexual harassment. There is a really specific legal definition of sexual harassment that we're going to be focused on. What can you do if you see it or experience it personally? What about this like prevention piece? How do we prevent it, not just sort of respond to it? And then what is the broader cultural change piece, that how can we not just prevent it in our own little sphere, but how do we actually change the culture around sexual violence? I have all the questions that people submitted in advance to SoundGirls through Carrie. So I'll try to answer a bunch of them as we go along, and I'll sort of like name that I'm answering that question in case you're the one that submitted it, but we'll get to more questions at the end as well. So this Here for the Music campaign we launched in 2017. We focus on training, on policy consulting, on advocacy, and on on-site support. So we do actually do support and like response services that we contract out to licensed counselors. We have trained over 2,000 people in the music industry, artists, touring crew, venue staff, and music fans. So really, again, thinking about all the people who are participating in a show, and we're training them on prevention. How do you prevent sexual violence? And then how do you compassionately respond if someone does report to you? And we excitingly will have sort of this full online training and bunch of toolkits with policies and sample sort of pieces that you can implement coming out later this year. So if you're interested in that, make sure to follow Calling All Crows on socials, and you'll, or sign up to our mailing list, and you'll get that information as it comes out. So we're going to go into like what is sexual harassment, right? And so I guess to step back, this just a big content warning on this. We're not going to do a deep dive into sexual violence, but we are talking about sexual harassment. It is a challenging topic. So, take care of yourself. If you need to take a break, grab water, do whatever you need to do. But we're not going to be asking you to share experiences of your own sexual violence here, or be digging into anything graphic, but we are still talking about sexual violence. So just want to name that for you. So on here, we have this continuum of behaviors going from healthy and mutual and age appropriate to mutually flirtatious to non-mutual or age inappropriate to harassment and abusive and violent. And we like to think about this continuum because it is a legal framework is more narrow than this, and we are going to talk about the legal framework of it. Like we'll get to that in a minute. But I think this continuum is really helpful in like the real world, because we're not just trying to like prevent the legal definition of sexual harassment from happening, we're trying to prevent all forms of violence from being done and happening in our spaces. And when we think about all of these things on a continuum, we can really start to think about where can we intervene so that things don't slide all the way to abusive and violent. And the one thing I'll flag on here is we talk about age appropriateness. That has a legal meaning to it. So we're not making judgments on age gaps between people, but there are legal consent ages. And so a 2-year gap at like 16 to 18 in some states is actually illegal, depending on the activities being done, versus like a 2-year gap at 38 to 40, no one blinks an eye at. And so there is a legal version of appropriateness. It's not particularly a judgment here on what we think is an acceptable age difference. So we'll sort of just keep this in your brain that there is a continuum of behaviors and that there are things on the healthy side and there are things that are harmful. And we really do think about things as healthy and harmful. And it's all context specific. It matters what the relationships look like, right? Like you can't just say, here's a list of behaviors you cannot do, because it depends on how they're applied to someone, right? Like hugging can be incredibly healthy. It can also be harassment depending on how it's done, right? Like I've experienced a real creepy hug. It was not mutual and it was like intended to make me feel uncomfortable, right? And so those things that like you can't just have a list of behaviors that are good and bad, because the context matters. And so we really need to like get out of this desire to just have a list of things we can and cannot do, because it is not that straightforward. But it's not rocket science either. So let's get into some definitions. There are federal laws and there are state laws. I pulled the California state law because I am in California, but you should look up your own state law. And it's like quite easy to do that on your state government website. But it's a civil law under Title VII. It covers employers who employ or have employed 15 or more employees for each working day in 20 or more calendar weeks in the current or preceding calendar year. It's narrow. So if you work for a company of 5 employees, you don't have as much protection under federal law against sexual harassment. So there are limits to this law. Sexual harassment in California is illegal under the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. It extends protections to employees, unpaid interns, professional relationships, and independent contractors. So it really does differ by state and by federal law. Some states extend protections to independent contractors, many do not. And so those are things that you actually want to look up and understand and like you don't need to be a lawyer to understand what, like which tax forms do you fill out, right? Are you a contractor or are you an employee? And do you have protections under the law are something that you can figure out pretty easily without a lawyer. And I recommend doing that before you are experiencing sexual harassment, because if you are in that situation, you are very stressed out and it is like hard to read legal documents. But when you're just bored on a Tuesday, you can look up those laws and really understand like, where do you even have protections? It's an eye-opening activity. I think people have this idea that like, in the States, we have all of these protections under the law, and you will probably learn quickly that it's more limited than you might think, which is why we go back to that continuum of behaviors. At Calling All Crows, like we're not just trying to prevent illegal behaviors, we're trying to prevent harmful behaviors, because the law is not like our moral compass, and the law does not draw the line at where we think behaviors, acceptable behaviors really should be drawn. It's just about legal protection. So this is what the law looks like. Sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual, physical, or verbal conduct in the workplace. And there are 2 main kinds. There's called quid pro quo, which became profoundly famous in recent years. You give me something, I give you something. And then there's a hostile environment. So it's severe or pervasive. It's subjectively and objectively hostile. So you have to think that it's hostile, and then like an objective observer also has to think that it's hostile in order to like meet this hostile environment piece. So we'll give examples of each of these in a minute, but so these are the 2 things that can allow a sexual harassment claim to move forward. So something very straightforward. You know, I think we often think about quid pro quo as the one of, you know, if you do the sexual act, I'll give you a promotion. Hostile environment has, you know, a little bit more there. So it could be one incredibly severe act. So a rape in a workplace would reach the level of hostile environment, even though it's only one act. One unwelcome sexual comment is not a hostile environment. That will not reach the level. So you would have to show like a pervasive format there. So either severe or pervasive. Obviously, if both are there, you're going to have a better case. Retaliation for resisting, complaining, or opposing. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up the chat to just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, great. So, and Carrie, feel free to like wave at me if I'm missing important things at the chat. So for retaliation for resisting, complaining, or opposing, so this is something that you do also have protections under. So this is not like you experiencing sexual harassment, but if you make a complaint of sexual harassment or you participate in an investigation, you cannot be retaliated against. That is also protected under the law. That does not mean that you won't be retaliated against, just to be clear. Like, I'm not like promising you that just because something is under the law protected that people won't break the law, but you do have legal rights that you could make a claim and go through that process to say, hey, actually you cannot legally retaliate against me for making a complaint or for participating in an investigation process run by the company. So those are protected activities in your workplace. And you're also, like, if someone is interfering with your right to a workplace free of sexual harassment, you know, all of the people who either complain or who support the complainant really do have the right to participate in making sure that someone has that workplace that is free from sexual harassment. And so if you are retaliated against or people are interfering with you participating, you have legal rights and can fight that. So those are really the pieces of it. So we're going to dig into it because I know that's just like a lot of legal words. Also, major disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. You should always, you know, I can like break down a definition for you, but if you're dealing with a specific case, you're going to want to talk to a lawyer who's in your state, because it's also by state. So we're going to talk about a specific example here. So Bill is a venue production manager. Sometimes he makes comments to the house audio tech, Anne, about how attractive she is. She never says anything when he makes those comments. One day, Anne requests a raise. Bill says that he will consider her request and suggests that the two of them go for drinks to discuss. Anne makes it clear that she wants to keep their relationship purely professional and would prefer not to go out with him. And Bill says that he understands. But 1 week later, Bill informs Anne that he has denied her request for a raise. She asks for an explanation, and he says that if she would be more cooperative with him, then her chance for a raise would improve. Anne asks, what does cooperative mean? Bill smiles and says, you figure it out. Right, so this is an example of quid pro quo, that Bill is trying to get Anne to go out with him socially. There's like a pretty big undertone of of sexuality in these requests to go out to drinks, to, you know, cooperate, to be more cooperative in order to get that raise. And he has power over Anne to make that assessment about whether or not she gets a raise. So this would be an example of quid pro quo sexual harassment. The pieces at the beginning, right, about like him making comments about how attractive she is, really add into that element of making it clear that there's that sexual undertone or overtone, quite frankly. But that just comments about how attractive she is without the other pieces may not actually like reach the level. And those are things that you might find frustrating. You may think that it should be like not okay to make any sort of sexual comments or advances at your workplace. And I would agree with you, but that doesn't mean you have legal protections around it. And so this is what I'm trying to show you, the difference of like what you're legally protected against versus like what we're trying to work for in a workplace to be fully safe are two different things. but the legal tool is one piece that you can really understand and think about where are you protected and where can you be pushing back, or really making sure if you're a company leader, where are you really understanding the law and like what do you absolutely need to do from a legal perspective versus what can you do to make it better than what the law mandates you do. So that's a quid pro quo example. Now we're going to talk about one that is the hostile environment example. And this is based on a real example. These scenarios are based on real life examples that have been submitted for use in these kinds of trainings. So a photographer is working on a photo shoot with many production staff on set, in addition to the model being photographed. The photographer repeatedly asks the model to touch herself, eventually stopping and telling her to put her hands down her pants and touch herself for the camera. She complies, but is visibly uncomfortable. So this would be a hostile environment, right? There was no quid pro quo, but this is, conduct of a sexual nature that someone is being forced to do to sort of like participate in their work environment. And even though she might comply, that doesn't mean that it's her fault or that she is at fault for doing this. This was an unreasonable request and made a hostile environment. I will also just name that we used, an example with 2 women as the victims of this harassment, but sexual harassment can be done by anyone of any gender to someone of any gender. So this is not like men harassing women is not the only way that this shows up. It is the most common, but it is certainly not the only way that it shows up. And that can sometimes prevent people who are experiencing sexual harassment but don't necessarily see themselves in that narrative from bringing it forward. So really, this can be done by any gender to any gender. So what we're going to do here is talk about like, what if it's happening to me? So we've talked about this definition. Here are the 2 things. It can be quid pro quo, or it can be pervasive or severe instances that create a hostile work environment. So what if that's happening to you? The first thing I recommend is like call a sexual violence support hotline. We often sort of normalize sexual violence, and harassment is violence, to be clear. When I say sexual violence, sometimes people are like, well, we're not talking about only rape, but violence is much broader than just rape or sexual assault. Harassment is a form of violence. And when we're talking about sexual violence, we often normalize it because we're used to seeing it around us. But just because it is pervasive doesn't mean that it is okay. And it doesn't mean that it is not emotionally hard. There's often this idea that we should be able to just like deal with this like everyday sexism or this everyday violence, but it takes a toll, and ignoring that does not help you. And so, not that if you are not emotionally impacted by something, like you don't need to be, like that's great. If your resilience is up or something does not hit you, that's good. And you don't need to like force yourself to feel something because it's supposed to be bad. But you also can be gentle with yourself, and that if something is being done to you and it is impacting you, you should take the space to get the support that you deserve, because it has become so common to just accept this and roll with it that we sometimes undercut how much it can actually impact us. So RAIN is a national hotline, and they actually connect you to a local service provider. So if you know your local rape crisis center or whatever it is, you can skip a step and go directly to them. But if you don't know, RAIN has a national hotline that will either work with you if you don't have a local resource or connect you into your local resource. And they do a lot more than I think people often recognize. So they do emotional support. It's called crisis counseling, but crisis can mean that your, something that was done to you 30 years ago is coming up right now, or it could have happened 30 minutes ago, right? It's like they're trained to deal with a lot of different types of trauma. But they do more than that, like in the moment counseling. They can help you with safety planning, they can help you with legal information, and they can help you with case management. So they can help you get a referral to a lawyer. They can help you like with safety planning in your workplace. So if something's being done, you're worried about it, but maybe you're not yet at the point where you want to talk to a lawyer, or just something is going on, they can help make sure that you have a safety plan for your workplace, that you can like continue going there and feeling safe until you figure out like a larger way out of it. Because I think the reality is sometimes we need the paycheck, even if we don't really want to be working there. So that's something that they can help with, if is that safety planning. And then case management. So sexual violence impacts many parts of our lives, right? If it's at work, it's impacting our income. So a case manager may be able to help with finding like, you know, different housing if you apply for that, or there are just a lot more services there than I think people often realize. And it's going to depend on where you live, how like robust that is. But there are supports to help you navigate the many systems that sexual violence impacts, because it's not just your workplace, it's your home life, it's your housing, it's a lot of pieces that can be hit by this, and they can help to navigate that. So that's the first thing, is like, take care of yourself and like really figure out like, how can I get access to resources that you need. But really specifically in the workplace is learning your legal rights. So, you know, I do encourage all of you after this training is to go and look up what are your rights in your states. You may be surprised to learn that the filing deadlines for sexual harassment are tiny. So in some states, you have 3 months from the last incident to make a complaint, or you're out of luck. It varies by state, so you really just want to know what those timelines are. But, you know, you don't have a huge amount of time always to legally deal with sexual harassment. So if it's, it's from the last instance. So if you're dealing with it over time, the clock starts on that last incident in terms of your legal rights. So learn your legal rights. If it's happening to you, go and look up what is actually protected. Do you even have legal rights against what is being done to you? Again, something can be horrible and still legal. The second is really to just like get organized. So get any documents that you have that show, you know, the harassment. So if it's over email, any text, just anything that you can, is just get organized around that and like start compiling everything, get things in writing. If you have witnesses to it, sort of like write their names down, like really understand that if you're going to move forward with a case, you're gonna have to build a case. Like, this is not just you report something and it's done, sadly. Like, you have to build a legal case against someone if you would like action to be taken. You know, if possible, gather support. So that's something around, you know, like, do you have other people who have witnessed this? Do you know of other people who have experienced harassment at the same person's hands who might want to like sort of work together in putting a case together? This isn't something that's always possible, which is why we put if possible, but sometimes you may know of other people who've experienced harassment, or you've witnessed it to other people, and you may be able to gather some sort of support. Stay focused. This is, you know, we put this here, this slide comes from like a legal training I went through with Sharon and Lodgen, which is a law firm. I used to live in Boston, that's out in Massachusetts. And really, a big reason that they put this in here is it can feel overwhelming, and you might start thinking about all of the bad things that have been done to you in this workplace. You need to stay focused on the things that like meet the legal criteria, right? Like, someone making fun of you, well, shitty, is not illegal. And so really getting focused on what are the things that contribute to a hostile environment, or that that work quid pro quo, and containing to that is really important. Because again, if you're going to move forward with some sort of case, all of the extra stuff doesn't help you. And so even though those might impact you, they don't help your legal case. And a lawyer, you know, if you end up like really going through with a complaint in some sort of lawsuit, a lawyer will be able to help you sort through that, and you can bring all that stuff to a lawyer, that's fine. But oftentimes what you're going to do, and this is step 5, is follow your internal policies and procedures. So you're typically, you know, following this without a lawyer, right? Like, when you're just making an internal complaint, unless you have a lot of resources to get a lawyer sooner, most people don't, right? Because many people who are experiencing sexual harassment are in lower wage jobs and don't necessarily have the means to go and hire a lawyer just to file the complaint, which is paperwork, you know, like that might just mean talking to your boss, right? Like, whatever your company's internal procedures are, it should be in your handbook. And that's what you want to do first, but you want to sort of like understand your legal rights, get your information in order, understand who might be an ally to you and who might be able to lend credibility to the complaint that you're making, and then follow your policy. And hopefully that's sufficient, right? Like hopefully if you have all of that together, you can go to your company and think about like, okay, these are the things that are, you know, this is what's being done, I'm following the policy, what can we do about it? And so then this question about how does the state law work with touring, is the state that it happens in or the state the employer is registered in? The state the employer is registered in is typically how it works, but you would want to check that because it also depends on your employment status. Sorry, that was a question in the chat is, you know, all of this matters of whether you're an employee or a contractor. And if you're an employee, you're following your employer's handbook, and that is based on the state that they're in. But if you're a contractor, it's going to look different. And the contractor stuff is its own confusing legal mess because most states don't actually provide protections for contractors. So I will say that like the fact that California does is good, but not common. And so that is just something, again, where you want to just like understand your own state's rights, but you can look at, if you're an employee as opposed to a contractor, you should look at the rights of the headquarters of your employer. So you'll follow the internal policies and procedures, and then if that doesn't work, you know, you're going to repeat this likely with the help of a lawyer. This is the point where you really want to bring a lawyer in. I will say that like, if you have the means to bring a lawyer in sooner, it is never going to hurt you to have a lawyer sooner. But most people don't. And sometimes people feel like individuals might feel like, oh, once I bring a lawyer in, it escalates the situation. And so if that is a concern that you have, like really all of these steps 1 through 5, you can do on your own. And you just need to understand your company's policies and follow those. So that's what, if it's happening to you, is like first take care of yourself, right? Like call a hotline who can then help connect you to all of the resources you might need, both like emotional and legal, but then sort of gather your evidence and make a complaint to your company following your company rules. If it's happening to someone else at your workplace, it's different. So one thing to note is like, you really should read your handbook. If you're an employee, not a contractor, like read your handbook, because some places have a mandate about knowing about sexual harassment, you must report it. So if that exists in your handbook, you actually do have an obligation to report. And a very weird thing about sexual harassment laws is sort of like the way that they work is, did the company follow their procedure? So if the company's procedure is like all leaders at the director level and above must like respond to any sexual harassment that they know of or that has been reported to them, and they witness sexual harassment and don't do anything, that the company can be held liable because of the way that they wrote their policy, even though that's not actually the way the law is written, that there's not a mandate that people report something that they're witnessing. So that is a confusing mess for me to just say, read your handbook if you are an employee and understand what is in the handbook. And if you're someone who has power over writing your handbook, make sure that you understand what your policies actually are and that they're communicated to your employees, because I've seen a lot of companies who have this mandate in that their managers need to act on any sexual harassment that they have knowledge of, not just that has been reported to them. And I know of almost no companies that actually do that. So you want to understand what is written in your handbook from the perspective of what if it's happening to someone else, because you may have a legal like sort of requirement to act depending on the level that you're at, or not. But you should look and understand what your liability risk is by sort of stepping in or not stepping in. But we like to think about sort of what are the motivators for intervening, and then what are the barriers to intervening. And these change by person, but it really helps you to, if you like really start thinking about like, what prevents me from intervening when I see something going on? And what are the times when I have intervened? What motivated me? Because if you can start tapping into those motivations, then you can like get yourself in the moment to do something, right? Like really understand for you, like what holds you back from speaking up. So for a lot of people, they don't speak up because of safety concerns for their self or for the people involved, that they might not know how to safely intervene, so they don't. It's a very good reason not to intervene, by the way. Some people feel like it's not their place to do that. They're like, hey, this is not my business, not my place. I don't know what's going on. I'm not gonna say anything. Some people feel like they just don't know how to be helpful. They're like, I don't know what to do, so I'm gonna stay out of it. People are worried about escalating it. This often goes with safety, but just this worry that if they get in, it will get worse. Or that it could just be awkward, that they're like, I don't really know how to deal with this. I don't want to be like that guy. I don't want to be like that person who's always speaking out. So those are real barriers, and we might sometimes judge them, but I've like personally like sort of like been held back by all of these, right? Like it's useful to acknowledge what they are so that we can overcome them. And so when we think about what motivates us to intervene, it can also be the safety of others, right? Sometimes if you're like, oh, someone's about to get hurt, and if I go over there, I can be helpful, that can be an incredibly powerful motivator. If you have influence, or you really care about your workplace, so you're like, hey, I love my job and I want it to be safe, I'm really invested in this space being better, then you might be motivated to step in. If you do know what to do, right? Like when you don't know how to be helpful, you're less likely to, but when you have the skills to be helpful, you're more likely to intervene. You're afraid it could get worse if you don't intervene, and it's the right thing to do. And so I wrote these to be mirror images of each other, because they are, right? Like our barriers can become our motivators if we address them. And so if you're seeing yourself in some of these barriers, try and address them, right? Especially if it's something that you can actually build skill around. So if you don't know what to do, great, like take a training, learn what to do. If you don't want to escalate it, like learn some de-escalation like tactics, or think about times when you've been able to really successfully de-escalate something instead of escalate something, and really sit with these barriers so that you can proactively be able to step in when you see something happening. And so here's an example scenario. And if you're putting questions into the chat, I'll get to them eventually. So some of your touring crew gather for drinks at the end of the show. You've noticed that one of your coworkers tends to single out certain people, usually women and gender nonconforming people, and will ask detailed questions about their intimate relationships and sex lives. So you usually ignore it and either find someone else to talk to, or like go back to the bus or to the hotel or wherever home is for you at that moment. But this time you decide to do something. So then this is from the experience of a bystander, right? Like this is not being done to you. You are witnessing your coworker singling out people, asking detailed questions about their intimate relationships and sex lives. And typically you would ignore it, right? Like typically you're in that like, I'm gonna just walk away. But this is something when we say, hey, you're witnessing sexual harassment or you're witnessing harmful behaviors, what could you do? This is a scenario we're gonna dig into a little bit. So we have what are called the 5 Ds of intervention. So you can distract, delegate, delay, direct, or document. So I'm gonna bring it back to this other scenario so you can see it. So here, to create a distraction, this could look like a bunch of different things. So I'm gonna like give you examples of these, but you're all gonna like find your own way that works best for you. So a distraction here could literally be going over and just like changing the topic of discussion, right? Of just being like, hey, I am really bad at this right now because I have like no life because of the pandemic. But you could do something as benign as like asking about the weather, like really drastically just like change the topic of conversation. You could go over and the person who's being sort of grilled or singled out, you could be like, hey, I actually like have a question for you. I'm trying to like take a photo and I can't figure out this setting and I know you're really good at photos and like, would you mind like coming over here and taking a photo for me, right? Like you're not head on addressing what's going on, but you're trying to either move the topic along or pull that person out of the scenario. You could also distract the person doing the harm. So your coworker who's like grilling someone, you could just like flip it on them and start asking them a bunch of questions about, I don't know, whatever their job is. Just do something to get the heat off of that person is a distraction. Okay. So another one is to delegate. So you might feel like you're in a really vulnerable position in this crew. You might feel like you don't have good relationships or just not the right skill set to do it, but you're recognizing that something is going on. You can delegate to someone else to go and help, right? So I get delegated to all the time. I was on a like 4-month tour a couple years ago. And I feel like every day, and like, I mean, it was literally my job, so it was very above board. But every day, like, even if we were just out in the world, they were like, hey, Kim, there's a thing going on. And I noticed it, and like, can you go do it? And that was totally appropriate. Sometimes I was like, can you do it this time? No, I'm a little tired. But you can delegate to someone with a different skill set than you. It can also be someone with a different relationship. So for me, like, there were times when, you know, I was like the lowest rung on this ladder on that tour. People were like, why are you here? I don't understand why there's a sexual harassment lady on tour. And so I would delegate to like the headlining artist sometimes to be like, hey, you have the most power on this. You invited me to be here. You need to deal with this one. Like, I actually don't really have the same power or influence as you do, or the same relationship. And so can you take this one on? So really thinking about who has the skills, the relationship, or just the like presence, that sometimes delegating to like a giant sized person who can kick someone out of a club is very helpful. Sometimes delegating to like a small sized white woman is very helpful because no one wants to punch me in the face. And like, I have a de-escalating presence often in a violent situation. And like, those are things to think about, of like, I can go over to something in a different way than like a giant security guard can. And so those are just, you know, when we think about who do we delegate to, there are a lot of different people to delegate. But delegating is not like a cop-out. Like, you're still intervening, you're still helping by getting the person with the best skill set in there. Delay. So delay here would look like waiting until it sort of passes and checking in with the person who experienced that harm afterwards. So you may not get in there in the moment, but you might be able to afterwards say like, hey, I noticed that and that seemed really uncomfortable. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to support you? Or is there anything you wish I had done to support you in the moment? Right? Like, check in with the person who was just harmed. This is way undervalued, by the way. We witness harm all the time, and we just like let it slide by. And this is something where even if in the moment you didn't like you weren't close enough, or you just didn't know exactly what to do, checking in afterwards and seeing how they're doing, if there's anything you can do to support them, and especially if it's your coworker, if there's anything they wish you had done so that next time you can do it, is a really powerful thing, because it acknowledges that something bad was just done to them and not that it was normal. Right? Like, when you're in a group of people and someone is harassing you and no one says anything and then no one checks in with you afterwards, it's an incredibly isolating experience. And obviously it's nice if in the moment someone can do something, but if someone checks in with you afterwards, that's still quite powerful and can help that person with healing and with moving forward. This is a place where I'm always hit by this sort of reality, is that this is a stat that's more about sexual like assault than about other forms of violence, but the person who someone first discloses an incident of sexual assault or rape to has a deep impact on their healing. So if someone says that they were assaulted and that person is dismissive, or does some like, it just sort of brushes it off or does something, that person who disclosed will take longer to heal. Like, that first person has a really huge impact on someone's trajectory to healing. So if you are proactively the first person that someone talks to after harm is done to them, and you are supportive and validating and kind, you're going to help them access healing sooner, because you are not minimizing it. You're not making them feel crazy that like, did that even just happen? Was that not that big of a deal? Like, if no one said anything, it must be fine, right? And that is a really powerful thing you can do. I focused a lot on delay of checking in with the person who was harmed. You can also check in with the person who did the harm, particularly if you know them. Really don't recommend doing this to a stranger. It won't be effective and it puts you at risk. But if it's your coworker, checking in with them afterwards and saying like, hey, that was not okay. And like, what were you doing? Why were you doing that? Is a powerful thing you can do as well, and can sometimes be more effective than doing it in the moment. Like, you know your coworkers the best, and you're going to be able to assess that in the moment, but sometimes privately checking in afterwards is more effective than doing it in a large group. That said, the next D is direct, which is directly addressing it in the moment. So there are absolutely times where that's appropriate, and where that is the most helpful thing that you can do. So in this scenario, that would look like stopping, like interrupting this line of questioning and saying like, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this line of questioning. It doesn't feel appropriate for our workplace. Like, can we change topics, please? That's it. It doesn't have to be a fight. It doesn't have to be more dramatic than that. If they dig in and are wanting to battle you over it, like you know, can use whatever strategies make sense for you. But if someone is really pushing on this and being like, no, like this is fine, like why are you so PC or whatever, like random things people throw around right now, and just be like, look, can we just, you know, just like introduce a new topic, like just keep it moving, right? Like, again, you're the bystander. This isn't being done to you. When you're the person who this is being done to, it is way harder to do this. But when you're witnessing it, like that is a place where you get to go in and be like, no, like I just really don't want to do this. Can we like move on, right? Like take that heat, be the person who's like not conflict averse in that moment, because it's not actually being done to you. And if you can take the heat off the person who's being harmed, that is intervention. That is being actually supportive. The last thing on here is document. This is important in your workplace. So this is like sort of goes back to what we were talking about before. If you are able to like write down your account of something that happened immediately afterwards, that actually has more like legal meaning than if you recount it 3 weeks later. So if you witness something, you think it's harmful, you write it down, date it, put like details of where you were. If the person who is being harmed decides they want to move forward with a case, your like writing of that is going to be more helpful. I actually think the best way you can do it once you have access to a computer is send an email to yourself, because then it will be time-stamped, because you can't like fake that in the way that you could just like fake a journal date on a piece of paper. So documenting can be a written account. If you have photo or video evidence of it, you know, that can be useful, especially in a scenario like at a bar where your colleague is doing that. If you tape it, then like you're gonna have video evidence. It's not like my recommendation for your first go, especially if they're all people you know, but there are ways to sort of document what is going on. And particularly if anything is done through email or text, is to document that and keep those records, so that if someone decides they want to move forward, you are able to produce those documents that will be helpful to them. I'm going to pause there. And if people have questions they want to type in around these intervention strategies, let me know. And otherwise, we're going to move on to a couple other examples. Also, just sometimes being talked at about sexual violence nonstop is hard. Okay. So what we have left on the agenda is to go through a handful more scenarios and then talk a little bit more about like broader, how can you plug into this work, and then get to a bunch of questions that you all have. So, and I'll try to answer some of these questions through the scenarios themselves. So here's an example here. You're working for the venue, setting up before doors. You your colleague at front of house with the touring engineer. The touring engineer has been talking to your colleague animatedly for a few minutes that you've observed, and she seems to be laughing along, but is also behind where she's normally at in her tasks for the night. So you have the touring engineer sort of like chatting up your colleague front of house. You've seen it for a couple minutes. She seems to be laughing along, but is behind in her tasks. So first of all, like, there's warning signs, but you can't point to this and say like, this is sexual harassment, right? Like we don't know what's going on here, but there are some flags that we want to pay attention to. So one is that like, there's a power dynamic between touring crew and local staff. And whether it's touring crew or the headlining artist or whatever it is, there is the power dynamic of like the people who are sort of like coming in through for the night versus people who are there all the time. The number one, like anecdotally, the number one complaint I hear about sexual harassment is touring crew on local staff, which is why this shows up, is the number, including like fan harassment. Like we ask not just people working, but people who are attending shows. And that is overwhelmingly the thing we hear about the most. And so this is a flag. And it doesn't mean that there's something bad there, by the way, but it's just something you want to pay attention to, right? Is like two people who are sort of isolated, who don't always work together, and someone who's sort of lagging in their tasks for the night, because that means that it's probably been going on for a little bit longer. And seems to be laughing along is key here too. I think sometimes people are like, oh, look, she's having fun. Maybe she's like enjoying it. Maybe, but also customer service and like all of the world teaches us to like laugh along with things and like hope that they just move along, right? Like there is a power dynamic here. It's her job to like make sure this is a functioning working relationship, and she might just be laughing along to try and get out of that situation. And you know, I don't know, maybe some of you have experienced this. For those of you who haven't, like here's a nice insight into the experience of a lot of people who are in workplaces, is oftentimes you're sitting there being like, oh my God, I wish anyone would come over right now and do literally anything to make this stop. Like make me mop floors. I don't care. I just wish something external would happen so that this situation would move on, right? Like I don't want to have a conflict. I don't want to make a big deal out of this. I just want it to go away. Like, and if you can come over and just be that distraction, right? When we think about those 5 Ds, when you see warning signs, but no like obvious harm, just showing up and asking a question is a great way to do that, because this is a workplace. This is not a social space, right? Like you can just go over and be like, hey, is everything going okay here? Like I actually need some help out back. And if they were actually like mutually flirting, they will flirt right around you. You did not like break a long like future love story. It's fine. If you like, if this is all above board and it's super mutual, you going over and inserting yourself and creating a distraction, they will like go back to whatever they were doing before once you leave. But if that person did not want to be there, like they will take that out in a heartbeat, right? They are just gonna be like, yes, I will do whatever random task you just asked me to do. And so if there's any sign of like something seems a little bit off, like if you're feeling that, just go over and create a distraction. And sometimes even just your presence can be enough to make that touring engineer go away if what they're doing is sort of like not work related, right? And so this is a major place for that. And so we give this scenario to sort of highlight that prevention has to happen before the bad happens. I think sometimes people want a clear-cut sign before they step in. But if you wait for there to be sexual assault for you to step in, someone already was sexually assaulted. Like you're too late. And I'm not saying you should definitely step in if you see that happening, please go over. But we can't wait for the like giant neon, this is bad sign to step in. We need to sort of pay attention to these warning signs of harmful behavior. And that doesn't mean we need to go in like guns ablaze every time, but just using these different intervention strategies to step in to like get more information, right? What you can do by getting closer to the situation is understanding if you actually witnessed anything at all. What you might have seen was actually just normal, and like they could have been talking about work and she just happens to be having a slow night and they made a funny joke. Like it could be as simple as that. But you won't know until you're a little bit closer to it, and why take the chance? So this is a scenario. You're the merch manager for the headlining act. You're working with your venue contact to count in. You notice your venue contact is repeatedly referring to the supporting artist's merch manager. So again, you're the headlining merch manager. The support artist merch manager is sweetie and baby, and commenting that he'll handle the mask since it's not girl's strong suit. This is a real example, by the way. He then offers her a ride back to the buses, stating he's surprised that they even let men alone with women, given the Me Too climate these days. So this is a space where you see someone sort of like being sexist, right? Like we can just saying math is not girl's strong suit to someone whose part of their job is literally to do math is sexist. And the like constant sweetie and baby, especially if it's only to like one person, it's like sort of a domineering thing. And if you're witnessing this from a position where you have a little bit more power than this, right? Like you work for the headliner, you can go and like sort of intervene in a different way. This is something where you can really like have more influence than if you're the person who it's being done to, right? And so we do a lot of trainings that are bystander trainings because people always want to know what they're supposed to do if they're being harassed. And the answer is it's way harder if you're the person experiencing it. This is why we train bystanders, is like, if you are experiencing violence, like your body is in stress. You're not like accessing the logic part of your brain. And having someone come in and like help interrupt that and like let you come back to your body and get out of that situation is really important. And so we don't train you in like self-defense or how to like avoid sexual harassment. we provide people prevention training, because if you are being sexually harassed, like, it is not your fault, and there isn't something you could have done to get yourself out of that. Like, we have to create environments that are hostile to violence instead of welcoming to it. And the ways that you can do that are when you witness something like that, not letting it slide, and really making sure that you go in and like help this person out, even if you do it in an indirect way at the start. So here, you know, you might want to really like check in first with the artist or with a support merch manager and see how they're doing. Like that is an actually really aggressive comment to say, like, I'm surprised they even let men alone with women, is an intimidating comment. He might not act on that, but like, he is naming out loud the vulnerability of her alone in like a car or a golf cart or whatever it is with him. Like, if he did not have any, like I've been in cars with men all the time, no one has ever said that to me. It's a very intimidating comment meant to display his power over her. And I think sometimes people sort of like dismiss that, but that is like a pretty outrageous thing to say after you've also just been like displaying your sexism all day. And so those are things when you're witnessing it, is like, go over and check in on that person and see how they're doing, and ask if, you know, if they want support, ask if they want, you know, your help in like talking to the production manager or their boss or something to get sort of support around that. And then follow their lead, right? Like, if they say like, no, I really don't want to do anything about this, and nothing was done to you that you can like sort of use your own experience to document, you know, it's not necessarily your place, but you can at least ask them like how you can help support them and how you can help make them feel safe for the rest of your time at that venue together. But oftentimes, in my experience, what I've witnessed is that like, if you in the moment like really proactively go over and check in and see how they're doing and ask if they want support, a lot of times people will take you up on it because they don't feel alone anymore. And especially for something like this where you're touring, like, yes, you might have to go back to that venue again, but you're not gonna have to see that person every day. It's different than it being someone on your own crew who you have to like go back to the bus with all the time. So it's always worth checking in and saying like, hey, do you want to do something? Because a lot of people don't realize they can, right? Like, I've had a situation similar to this, and I checked in with that person and they were like, what do you mean do something? And I was like, well, you don't, like, that's not acceptable workplace behavior. Like, you can report it if you want and like make sure that whatever. And she's like, what do you mean? Like, she's like, I thought that was just normal. I thought I just had to put up with things like that. And so you can be that prompt to be like, hey, do you want to do something? And this is maybe prevention for her, maybe not, maybe she'll never end up at this venue again, but it's prevention for all the future people who have to put up with this, this venue merch manager who is dealing with people day in and day out and maybe doing similar things. And so when we think about prevention, yes, there's like the individual things that you can do, right? Like, if you see something being done to someone else in your sphere, you can go over and interrupt the behavior as it's happening or right before it is done. But we need to do more than just those like in the moment interventions. So that may be what you're able to do from the role that you're in. And that's great. If that's what you can do from your role, like, do it. And that's your pocket of influence. But if you're in a leadership position, or you're someone who has influence in your workplace to be able to like push for broader prevention beyond those like one-off in the moment interventions, some things that work well are creating and actually communicating policies that are effective. So we see this a lot on tours. I saw a question about like, how does the law work with touring? If you're on a US tour, you protect under state and federal law, like, how do all those things work? Like, really making sure that your company is creating and communicating their policies super clearly is a big part of this confusion, particularly in touring, where you're changing states and countries and just all of these things all the time. The legal protections might be fuzzy and they might not be that strong, but your company protections can still be better than what the law provides to you. And that you have way more influence on what your company does with sexual harassment than what the law does with sexual harassment. So if you can influence what your policies are and say like, okay, if the company says like, when this is done, here's who you report to and here are the action steps that are going to be taken, that's what you want. Like, yes, the legal things are important and you should ask questions and like really dig into it, but to be like just blatant about this, the majority of sexual harassment complaints go nowhere under the law. I know that's like not what you want to hear. That's why I'm not a lawyer. I like really considered law school. I worked under a labor lawyer, and it is painful how many complaints just sit in a file and are not investigated. I think it was like 33,000 sexual harassment claims were filed last year, or maybe 2 years ago. And of those, like a very, very tiny percentage get litigated. That like the law is your last protection. And what you can really do is push your company and your workplace to just do better on their own without the legal protection, and like do these proactive things so that you're hopefully not in the place where you need to make a complaint against your employer at a federal or state level. So those resources are available to you, but it's not a very strong network of protections for you, especially in the music industry where it's so contractor based, and different states provide different levels of protection for contractors. I mean, you saw that at the federal level, a company has to have at least 15 employees working like a certain number of hours for a certain number of weeks over the year. A lot of music industry companies don't reach that bar, which means you're not protected under the law, but you can still push for the spaces that you're in to have stronger policies and codes of conduct that there may not be legal teeth, but you can point to it and make it clear and push for those to be followed. The other part of a policy is that, like, yes, it needs to be clear. Yes, people need to know what it is, right? Like a policy that no one knows about is not very useful, but you also have to train people on how to implement it. So I think this is a place that we've seen a lot of managers technically have all of this like responsibility about how to respond to and investigate a sexual harassment claim, and they've received zero training on what they're supposed to do. And that's incredibly common. That's not just the music industry, that like people just aren't trained on this. There's only six states in the country that require sexual harassment training in workplaces. But all of them have a sexual harassment like protection mandate in some way. But that doesn't mean anyone's trained on how to actually do anything about it. And so pushing for your company to actually train their staff on what the hell they're supposed to do when they get a complaint of sexual harassment, like how do they investigate it? How do they respond? You might have someone who's incredibly well-meaning, but is garbage at investigating a complaint because they go overboard. I mean, I think we have this picture of someone who is callous and uncaring, but there's also the manager who's way too involved in someone's life, who goes way over the top and is like too pushy and like wants all of the emotional side of it. And that can be just as harmful as someone who doesn't care at all. And so because it's about sexual harassment is often about a boundary being violated. And if you have someone like all up in your business nonstop, that's another boundary being violated. So there's training helps people understand, like, how do I maintain a professional, compassionate boundary? And how do I support someone who just, reported, by understanding that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a therapist, I'm not these things, but I can help them find those things, right? I can name that they deserved better and that I can help them find those resources and like just conduct a professional investigation. That's sort of the extent of what a manager can do. But there are trainings to provide that, but most people aren't trained. There's also trainings on intervention. So I did a very, very quick version of like what a bystander training looks like, but giving people the actual skills and knowledge and practice time. Like, obviously this is not an interactive seminar. There's not that like practice part of these scenarios, but digging into that with your team gives you the tools to be able to do prevention in your space. Awareness and accountability. So this is something where like talking about it, like coming to seminars, like talking about it, making this part of our normal safety conversations. I think what we've tried really hard at Calling All Crows to do is push these forms of harassment into the sphere of workplace safety, that it's not different than like wearing a hard hat in a space, like that these things should be taken as seriously as other forms of violence and like workplace safety issues. And that requires like training, and it requires policies, and it requires making sure people know what the heck they're supposed to do. And that like if you had someone who was walking around like taking people's like safety equipment off of them, that person would be fired. Like, that's it, because you're making someone unsafe. But if you have someone going around like constantly like hitting on and making people feel uncomfortable and like groping people in the workplace, we're like, I don't know, maybe we should talk about it. But that's like a deep form of workplace harassment and like making people unsafe in their workplace. And we want to push this into that conversation about workplace safety, not have it be like a women's issue or some side thing that we like kind of care about sometimes. And a big part of that in prevention, and this is something like we've shown, that when there are more women in leadership and more women in workplaces, we do see less sexual harassment in workplaces. So the risk factors for sexual violence, like in a workplace, so for sexual harassment, and again, this doesn't mean that it like has to happen all the time, but these are the risk factors that make it more likely to be done in a workplace. Workplaces that have high incidence of like alcohol in their workplace, that are male dominated, that have like lots of different like power differentials, and people with varying levels of like job stability, right? So if you have hourly workers and like union workers and this, like people with lots of different job stability, there's a lot of different power dynamics there. Because at the end of the day, sexual harassment is about power. It's a crime of, or like a form of harm that's done around power. And so if you have giant power differentials, there's more opportunity for harassment because you have so many different levels of power. Whereas if you have like only, I don't know, like 2 forms of power in your workplace, doesn't mean that sexual harassment can't occur, but there's just less opportunity for it, because it's actually quite hard to harass someone who's exactly on the same footing as you. Doesn't mean you can't find a way to do it, but it is harder to do than if you're like the headlining artist and you're like a venue bartender. Like there's just such a gap there in power that it's quite easy to manipulate that and to abuse that power. So this is the last thing before getting to a bunch of questions people ask. So just want to name some opportunities for people who are feeling like excited to plug into this sort of culture change work. It's fine if you're not, by the way. You're allowed to just want to like have a safe workplace and not change the world. That is a very reasonable way to feel, and I respect it. Like the fact that you want to have a safe workplace is something in and of itself. But if you're feeling like, no, I really feel energized by this and want to like, really push my workplace, not just figure out what I can do within my own little sphere of influence, you can organize a training at your workplace. You can ask the company, but also like really think about your network and your sphere of influence. Ask all of these companies, these touring artists, these venues, all of these folks, like ask them to sign on to, we have a pledge coming out tomorrow that's around like saying, sort of pushing to come out with policies with trainings and do these things. It's a pledge just because there's no live events right now. So there's like, that's as much teeth as we can have until live events and like actual in-person gatherings are back. But you can sort of ask people to sign on to being part of this, can volunteer skills, and you can sort of keep mentoring and advocating for and supporting women and non-binary people in the music industry, since those are the folks who experience the most harassment. So I have a question here. So I'm confused why you're calling venues, bands, production groups the company. In my experience, they're the client. And harassment laws do not apply to any of them. If I've had a complaint about harassment regarding a tech to my client hired. Yeah, so this is why I talked about if you are an employee versus an independent contractor, right? Like many people are employees. If you are an employee, like I've worked with bands who all of their touring staff are actually signed on as employees, not as independent contractors. If you're working for a venue, you're often an employee. So your point, Aubrey's question, stands that this is why the legal landscape is really tough in the music industry. These laws only apply to you if you're an employee. Going back to these slides about like what are the sexual harassment laws, you have to have 15 or more employees for it to be applied to you. So I think the legal protections are only one part of the puzzle. And so talking about how do you not only like, yes, understand your legal rights, understand what they are, understand like the limits of them, but really pushing on all of these other things that are about prevention of how do we actually create environments that are going to be safe? Because the law doesn't provide a ton of protections, especially in the music industry where so many people are independent contractors and don't have legal protections. So the law is limited. And so when we think about like, what are the things that we can do? So if you have a client where, let me read this more closely. I've had a complaint about harassment regarding a tech my client hired. So what are the things that you can do if you are either sort of experiencing yourself or receiving complaints about someone who's harassing people that you don't actually like, you know, they're not an employee of your company. They might be someone you have to work with. What can you actually do? And this is where it comes back to, you know, if it's happening to you, you still want to call this hotline. They can really help you think about safety planning about these different pieces. But I think this is, it's an unsatisfying answer, right? To understand that like, you can't control other people's behavior. You can't. What you can do is try to be as proactive as humanly possible to really push for there to be a policy that you can then point to. So when you take a gig, understanding like, what are your sexual harassment policies and protocols? What will you do if one of the people in your company harasses me or one of my employees, if you manage other people? What will be the response? What will be the process? And, you know, I know some people sometimes sort of like say, well, that might mean I don't get the gig. That is the reality of the world that we live in. I have walked away from a lot of jobs and it sucks. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's right. And that's why we're doing this culture change work, right? That is why the organization I work for is pushing for companies to do better on this, because right now it's up to individuals to make decisions about the workplaces that they work in. And so, you know, one thing you can do is really ask these questions up front before taking a gig is like, what is your sexual harassment policy and what will you do if something happens, knowing that there are not legal protections in place, that you want to understand like, what's the process for reporting and what will be done. And if they don't have a satisfactory answer to that, you know, go in eyes wide open about that. And I think that's important and it's unfair. I just want to name that. Like, that's a really unsatisfying answer. But it's still good to ask up front, because you will sometimes be pleasantly surprised, right? I think I asked this, and I ask this in literally every interview I do when I'm doing, because I am a full-time employee now, but I was I was gigging for a while. I was doing independent contract work. And I would ask every person, like, what will you do in the case of harassment? And for the most part, they were like, excuse me, what? Like, I've never been asked that before in this context. And I was like, yeah, it's not surprising to me, but like, what would you do? Like, I need to understand if I'm going to work here, like, if I'm harassed and I need to make a complaint, who do I report to and what will you do about it? And for the most part, they were like just sort of confused by that question. But there were some places where they were like, wow, I've never been asked that and I don't actually know the answer, and that's a really big problem. Let me go figure that out for you and come back to you. And that place now has a policy in place. Because some of this is benign, right? Like, a lot of people just sort of like whoops into bad management practices because no one's telling them what to do. There are places where that is not going to be the response, right? Where they're going to be like, if you're going to be all like high and mighty about sexual harassment, like, this isn't the place for you. And like, if you have the financial stability to walk away from that, really encourage you to, because sexual harassment is expensive to recover from. You know, I think we weigh these things about like, okay, well, I can't like walk away from every job. But when we ask these questions proactively, you might find that there are more jobs that want to support you than you realize right now. And that there are a lot of, you know, I think I was out on tour with, there was one other woman and like a 35-person crew for one of these, but almost and we didn't, you know, I got hired in by the headliner, not necessarily didn't know the rest of the crew. And so like the production manager, the tour manager, a bunch of the audio engineers were like, I would be so upset if I knew this was happening to someone in my workplace, but no, I don't know about it. And like, when we reported, like, we had something happen to someone and it wasn't sexual assault, it was harassment, but it wasn't assault. We told the production manager, and that the person at the venue who was causing the harm was fired the next day because it was a pattern. We often think about, like, sometimes people get nervous that they're going to be like, they don't want to put someone's job at risk or they don't want to do these other things, but very rarely does someone get fired, period. It's very rare for someone to get fired for like a one-off thing. But if you report something, it might show a pattern of someone causing harm. And so like in other places, we sort of gave feedback about someone's behavior and they weren't fired, but they were given that feedback. And who knows, like maybe that person like changed their behavior, maybe they didn't, but it's okay. It's really good to find a workplace where you can make those reports and not feel like you're the squeaky wheel to say like every time like something is done to you that you can speak up, because that's part of culture change. Is like, unfortunately, we do need to make enough reports that there start being consequences for this behavior. And that doesn't mean, again, like if someone hits on someone and they just like misread the situation, overwhelmingly, they're not going to get fired for that. They just might be told not to do that. And hopefully they'll just like feel a little embarrassed and stop hitting on every woman that works in the music industry. You know, like that's not, you know, I do a lot of these trainings and I talk about like, stop treating work like your dating pool and you're going to have a better workplace. Like, you know, stop hitting on everyone that comes through and treat them like colleagues. And if something sparks, like whatever, go for it. But that shift, it seems basic, but the number of light bulbs I have seen go off, particularly for touring professionals who are like, but this is where I meet women. Like, where else am I supposed to meet anyone? I'm like, I don't know. That's what the internet is for. Like, go to a bar, stop hitting on your colleagues. It's not fair. It's not fair to like be hit on in every single workplace. And that change can often just like make people start to feel more comfortable. So, yeah, so I'm going to get to some of the questions. So if people have questions, we're just switching to the like question. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And, okay. So some of the questions that came in are there any skills that are easily overlooked in coping with sexual harassment in the workplace? So this is like if you're experiencing it yourself. I think the number one that I see is people just not actually coping with it. I know that's sort of like a basic answer, but like acknowledge that something was done to you and like draw on your coping strategies, whether that's journaling or going for a walk or drinking water or whatever your coping strategies are. Like when someone does something harmful to you, even if you think it's small, it's important to acknowledge it and to like process that rather than hold on to everything. And then you'll be able to like sort of get back to your job, especially if it's something that to you wasn't super big, but it still hit you. Is like, great, take a 5-minute break, do some jumping jacks, get back to work. But it's acknowledge what is being done and like process it, because stress builds up. And if you release stress, you can actually like release it from your body. As a woman in a leadership position, how do you manage people under your leadership who outwardly or vocally do not believe you're qualified because of your gender? Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh at that question. It's just, it really bums me out. So when people, because your gender dictates that they think you're not a good leader, how do you deal with that? That is really tricky. I wish that I had the answers to all these questions. I'm just gonna name that up front, but I can give you like my take on it. I've tried very hard to do two things. One is build relationships and allyships. Like being a woman or non-binary person in a male-dominated industry, you need to have a network. You just need to do it. And it doesn't mean it has to all be all women and other non-binary people. My music industry network is full of like straight white dudes, just an overwhelming number of like 40-something straight white dudes who have my back. And by building that network and building those relationships, like when someone is being a dick to you, you just know that you can like just push back. Like you manage them. You can be like, do you have a problem? Like, do we have a problem here? Like, do you want a job working for me or not? Right? Like, and I think sometimes we forget the power that we hold because we feel alone in this industry. And if you're able to build relationships, you can just sort of stand in your own power. Like you manage them. And if they're being a dick, like tell them that, like remind them that and you don't need to be hostile about it, but if they are like just undercutting you because of your gender, you're allowed to push back and you are a manager, be a boss, right? Like treat it like any other workplace problem. If they're underperforming on their job, what would you do? If they're pushing back against your leadership, how do you like give feedback around that and push back against it? And if you cannot overcome that, you're allowed to fire people who refuse to do their job. And again, it's not a power trip, but if someone is undercutting your ability to do your job and you are responsible for that job, give them feedback, work with them, try and get them to change their behavior. And if they don't, get rid of them. And I think this is something where like, sometimes like making sexual harassment and sexism just clearer and not feeling like it's like a women's issue. Like I just get that all the time. It's like, oh, well, it's like this like soft thing. It's not soft, it's a safety issue. It is a professionalism issue. And if people don't know how to behave at work and you give them feedback and they can't get their shit together, there are many people who want jobs. And like, there are consequences for their actions. You're not going to throw them in jail. You're just firing them. And I think like people just need to get more comfortable with the reality that there are consequences for behaviors. We try to give feedback on behaviors first, and if people don't listen to the feedback, they don't get to do the job. Like, that is how jobs work, and that is okay. And really think about other safety issues where you would not like put up with people putting safety at risk, and treat harassment in the same way. How do you as a leader successfully approach and resolve the many conflicts and forms of disrespect that exist within this dynamic? So I think it's similar. So right, like when people sort of go straight to your superiors, or some things that feel a little bit more subtle, they're like trying to lead your crew behind your back, doing these different things. I continue to sort of just say, like, think about it like any other management problem, and think about how do you give feedback, and how do you coach your employees? And if you don't have systems in place to do that well, build them. Right? Like, that's part of your job as a manager. Like, if you don't have an effective way to give feedback to your employees and people who report to you, find ways to build that in better, and be able to say, like, hey, here are the behaviors that are not working. Here's what I need you to be doing, and give really specific, concrete feedback. That's not like, hey, I don't like it when you feel this. Like, give behavioral based feedback of being like, okay, when you go straight, when you lead the crew behind my back by doing X, Y, and Z, that is not acceptable in this workplace. And I need you to like do these things instead. And you can do a coaching conversation, right? Of like, how do you, what are you trying to achieve when you do that? What you might find is that they're just trying to build their leadership skills and not actually undercutting you. And then you're like, okay, great. I'm so glad to know you want to build those skills. Can we find specific opportunities for you to take on that kind of leadership so that you can grow into that role while not undercutting me? Or they might just be being a dick, right? Like, you don't know, and that's okay. And you can ask those questions and figure out how to coach your employees. How do you handle blacklisting, even when non-retaliation protection is in place? It is still an issue. And I think acknowledging it is important. Like, I do not live in a fantasy world where there are no consequences for speaking out about sexual violence. Like I said, I've walked away from a lot of jobs. I make less money than I could. Those are realities that and those are sacrifices I'm able to make, and I've made the choices. But it's not in a vacuum. Like, I have had very few jobs where I did not experience sexual harassment. And I hit a point where I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I now work from home, even when it's not a pandemic. And you just need to figure out what your own threshold is and your own financial needs, your own, all of those different things. You just need to be really clear with yourself about how much money do you need to make? How much money do you want to make? What are the kinds of career opportunities you need? What do you want? And weigh the risks at each move. It's calculated and it's frustrating, but if you are really clear about it and just open-eyed about the fact that there are a lot of challenges in workplaces, and by the way, sexual harassment is not the only one, and sexism is not the only one. There are a lot of things that you need to weigh with every single career move you make, and naming that this is part of the decision-making that you need to make, while upsetting, is useful. That you can understand, can I actually go out on a 6-month tour if I don't know what they're gonna do if I'm sexually harassed? Is that a risk you're willing to take? It's not one I'm willing to take. It might be one you're willing to take. But for me, it's to me worth asking the question and risking not getting the job if I ask a question up front, being like, hey, what are your policies? What are you gonna do if this happens on tour? And if they think that that is such an offensive question that they're gonna blacklist me from their tour, I absolutely do not wanna be on that tour. But I also recognize that that comes from a place of being able to walk away from certain gigs. So those are just things you need to figure out from yourself. And this is where that network is really important. I invest heavily in networking so that I can walk away from bad things and go find good things. And being able to name that to someone else, by the way, is really powerful. Being like, hey, I'm coming to you because the last tour I just tried, I asked what they would do if sexual harassment like happened on their tour and they never called me back. I don't want to work there, but I do want to work for you. It's a pretty powerful thing to say to someone, is like, I trust that you're going to do the right thing and I really want to work for you. Like, help me find a job. So those are things that you can really invest in and are a little bit more in your control than things that like, it is possible that someone might blacklist you for speaking up or for being a problem, but you can try really hard to find the ones who are going to want to work with people who are very good at their job and want to do it safely. And there's a lot more of those than we sometimes think. We just don't always ask those questions. How can I get trained in handling sexual harassment and show that I have training to my employer? I love that question. So I think there's two different sides of it. So we do trainings at Colonial Crows on the like prevention side. In terms of actually like responding to a report of sexual harassment, we do less of that. We do a little bit of the like very basic, like how can you handle like a disclosure, but in terms of like an investigation, that's something that often is actually hired out to a lawyer. So in terms of that training, I think talking to your employer and understanding like what are their policies, how do they handle investigations of sexual violence? Some of them are done in-house, but for anything that they're actually worried might reach the legal level, it's overwhelmingly outsourced to a lawyer to do the investigation. So really all you need to be able to handle is the report and like who to talk to at their company. So you can get that through the training that we're doing a compliance version of our training that will be out this fall. So you can go through that training. And, unfortunately, fortunately, a lot of the training is like, you need to understand your own company's policies, like inside and out, in order to be able to handle it well. And I don't know every company's policies. So those are trainings that you can, if you organize a workplace training and like hire someone in who can adapt it to your specific policy, you can organize that and then be able to show that to your employer. The other version is to do the more like generic one that gets at compliance, but then you have to do the extra research of really understanding your company's policy and reporting procedures so that you know how to implement the skills effectively in that workplace. If you take away one thing from this training, well, I hope you take away more than one thing, but the thing I always take away when I give these trainings is like, sexual harassment laws are nonsense. Like, it's literally like, do you have a policy? Did you implement your policy? Like, that is like how like the federal government judges your complaint. So if their policy is to like do an investigation in this way, and they do the investigation in this way and have no finding, you don't necessarily have a claim because they followed their policy to the letter, which is like bananas. Okay, how do you handle a female boss who's treating you as another female more harshly than male coworkers and crew? So, I mean, this is something that it will depend a lot on your relationship with your boss. Like, if you have a boss where you can have a conversation about that, that's the best thing. And I think so overwhelmingly, what I've learned through this work is we all need to get a little bit less conflict averse. And like, if you are someone who's incredibly conflict averse, like start working on that with your like friends and safe places where you can practice difficult conversations, because it is a skill that is not encouraged and developed very well. And so much of sexual harassment is about being able to give feedback and have difficult conversations. And it's, because sometimes people don't know what they're doing. Sometimes they do know exactly what they're doing, but no one ever speaks up, so they just get away with it. And a lot of people are conflict averse. So if you're willing to sort of say like, hey, what you're doing is not okay and it's making me uncomfortable, and then they're like all of a sudden put on the spot, that might be enough of a deterrent to not do things. If they're every time they are sexist or harassing people, they get feedback about it, that is a great deterrent, right? Like, it may not be getting fired, but like getting constant feedback and getting called out on harmful behavior is also frustrating. And it just does not happen right now. People can, without any form of consequence, including just like a slap on the wrist, like, don't do that, it's harmful, people can get away with literal rape without anything. And so we just all need to get a little bit more comfortable with challenging conversations. And so if you have a female boss who's treating you more harshly than your male coworkers and crew, finding a way to have that conversation and asking questions, I think, is the best way that I've found to navigate challenging conversations. Is don't go in swinging, go in with questions of just being like, hey, you know, go in with like concrete observations and questions. And if you're able to do that, like, you're not going to win every time, but hopefully it won't be like a super escalated, like tense conversation that you work out, you know, leave feeling worse. But if you don't have a relationship where you can do that, or you've already tried and you just continue to feel like you're being treated more harshly, you know, the other thing again is like, start job searching. Like, if you do not like your workplace, you've tried to deal with it and it's not working, start looking around, start figuring out the supports that you need to be able to work in a workplace that isn't super supportive to you. And like, don't have your whole identity caught up in this workplace. You know, like, so much of how I deal with sexual violence all the time because it's my job, not like I'm being sexually violated all the time, but I have to hear these stories all the time, and it's really hard. And so I have a therapist, and I have good friends, and I have like a healthy eating routine. Like, you need to build up your personal resilience. And that does not mean you should put up with harassment. That's not what I'm saying. But if there are things that are like unsupportive workplaces are different than like hostile workplaces, and if there's a place where you're feeling like, okay, this is unsupportive, I don't feel like I'm thriving here, but I like the job and I want to get things out of it, understand that and figure out what exactly are you getting out of this job and where can you get support so that you can stick with it. And if you hit the point where you're like, actually, I'm not getting enough out of this job to put up with feeling unsupported, then start figuring out how you can get to another job. And like, just treat your career and yourself super professionally, and like, you're worth, you know, like finding a better situation, and you're worth like getting support outside of work to like put up with some things that are unsupportive to you so that you can keep going. So one of the questions is, how can you set a good example for others in the situation? So if you're on a crew with a leader who is dealing with this, how can you be a good ally? I think so much of like how you can set a good example, how you can be a good ally, is actually to be vocal. And that doesn't mean like calling out every single thing that you see, but one of the things I noticed, so I work, the band, one of the members who founded, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words, Chadwick Stokes is a musician. He founded Calling All Crows. He's in the band Dispatch. Dispatch piloted this Here for the Music campaign. So we were out on tour with Dispatch for a couple months. And by bringing this campaign on the road, they started talking about it publicly as a band, right? So they were talking about how like they don't want their fans to be sexually harassed at shows. They were asking touring parties the venue staff to like go through this sexual harassment training. We were asking venues for their sexual harassment policies. We were just introducing the topic. We weren't out there like doing crazy things. We were just talking about sexual harassment as something that is done and that we wish wasn't done. And the number of people who started sharing their stories of harassment with us was through the roof. And so those men in that band were like not people who had been sexually harassing or assaulting. This was not a PR move. This was like, they agreed to be supportive to this campaign, and they just started talking about it. And they had so many fans after every single show who would come up to them and share their stories of sexual violence. And no one had ever done that with them before. And it's because they started talking about it. They opened the door to this world and made it possible for people to share their experiences. And sometimes those experiences were at shows like years prior. So that we got a lot of stories of like fans of theirs who like had been groped at shows of theirs years in the past, or who had been like hit on in ways that made them uncomfortable by other fans. And they just never even thought to talk about it. And like years later, we're coming out and saying like, oh, this happened to me at your show. And I'm so glad that you're talking about it now, because I wouldn't send my daughter to your show alone because of what happened to me. And so being able to just start talking about this makes you a better ally, because it identifies you as a safer person. If you have never had anyone tell you about an experience of sexual harassment, that's alarming, because sexual harassment is done every single day. 1 in 2 trans people, 1 in 6 men, and 1 in 4 women will be raped in their lifetime. And so if no one has ever told you about sexual harassment or sexual violence, you're putting something out into the world that makes you feel like an unsafe person. And you can change that by like being someone who talks about this, like be the first person to introduce it on your tour. Be the person who's checking in with particularly the women and non-binary people in your crew and saying like, hey, how's this tour going for you? Are people messing with you? Are you feeling supported? Is there anything we can do to support you? Like, go out of your way to acknowledge that this is the water we swim in. It is full of sexual harassment, but that you can be a supportive person who just is there. And once you do that, what you'll start to see is that people will ask you for help closer to when it's happening. And then you'll have the opportunity to be an ally and step in. You know, that we were on that tour and we had a lot of reports of sexual harassment from the venue staff talking to us, not to their bosses, saying like, I deal with this here all the time. I'm so glad you're here. And, you know, I ask, you know, like, have you ever talked to anyone at work about this before? Have you ever reported it to anyone? And they were like, no, because it's the boss. The boss is the one doing it, right? And we get story after story after story of sexual harassment in the music industry. And we only got those stories because we started talking about it. We didn't send out a survey. I wasn't like asking people like, did you get sexually harassed today? But it is such a pervasive problem that is being done every single day that if you open the door to that conversation, people will oftentimes start opening up and like sharing their experience. And then you'll start to know where you can plug in and saying like, okay, well, I can be the person on every tour that I'm on who is like, especially if you're not a woman, it's really nice to have it be a guy who's the one who says like, hey, I think we should have this training. Hey, I think this is like, we should have signs up about like where to report sexual harassment for our fans, right? Like the patrons at the show also deserve a safe experience and we want to let them know who to get support from. And those are major things that you can do, is just talk about this in real ways that acknowledge that this is being done and show that you're a person who wants to make sure that anyone around you is having a good time by making sure that it's a safe place. So we as students are currently in the midst of exposing and hopefully removing a faculty member from our staff because of Title IX violations that are not being addressed. I'm hoping to learn more about what I can do as a student and team member to help resolve this issue and support survivors of assault. So this is someone, you know, a student exposing a faculty member for sexual harassment. What can you do as a team member to help resolve and support? This sort of goes back to the similar strategies. I really like encourage you to think about those 5 Ds of intervention, is like, what can you do from the role that you're in? Sometimes you can be really direct. Sometimes you can delegate to other people. Sometimes you can like create a distraction to interrupt something in the moment. But when you're talking about like creating a whole environment or thinking about accountability after something has been done, you know, being someone who is supportive in that process, someone who's not like shouting over the actual victims. I think really understanding who was harmed here and what do they want. That should be at like the center of any response. When you're talking about prevention, it's like, we really just are trying to prevent anything from happening. But once something is done, you really want to be listening to the person who was harmed. Like, what happened to them? What do they want? What do they want to see? So if the people who are harmed really want this faculty member removed, like plug into helping that, make that happen. If the person who was harmed really just wants therapy and can't afford it, help set up a fundraiser. You know, like figure out what is it that they actually want and need and support that person. And that is the best thing you can do on the response side, is like, the harm's already been done. Don't take this person's power away further by doing things they don't want. Like, ask what they want, listen to what they want, and support that call to action. And then work really hard to proactively prevent something like that from happening again, which might mean in this case, right, like removing the person who has done harm. But you also want to think about the system that they worked in. What about that college allowed that professor to, or that faculty member to cause so much harm in the first place? How do you, like, you know, use that as a rallying call to push for better policies, to push for better training, to push for those prevention things and not just the accountability after the fact? because once you're in response place, the harm's already been done. And you can prevent further harm, but so much of what we're trying to do is, I love working with survivors, but I am striving to not have to work with survivors anymore, because we stop producing survivors, right? Like, people cause harm, and if we can prevent that, we won't have to do response anymore. And it is useful and good to have some skills around response. But if you put your energy into the prevention side of things, hopefully you don't need to have as strong of a skill on response. And then how to stop some of the gateway behavior before it gets worse. This is my favorite question. I didn't mean to leave it to last, but I did. And so that works out. So we think about this continuum of behavior, right? So from healthy and mutual all the way to abusive and violent. And there were, let me just find it again, rather than try and describe it to you. So you have this continuum. And what you want to do to prevent, like, the gateway behaviors, or prevent harm before it gets all the way over to abusive and violent, is encourage the things in green and start intervening as soon as you switch over from green to red. Like, don't wait for things to get to abusive and violent. So really think about what are the behaviors that fall under this sort of like non-mutual space, and how do you like make sure to draw the line before that? Because a lot of places draw the line at somewhere around harassment and abusive and violent, which means that you have created an environment that is welcoming to everything above that line. So if your line is at abusive and violent, you're creating an environment that is welcoming to harassment, to non-mutual behavior, and then to these other healthy behaviors as well. So if you draw the line at non-mutual, you're going to definitely clear out the abusive and violent things, because people don't like go straight to rape, they dip their toe in, right? Like, so in an environment, they'll typically, like maybe at a bar, right? So you'll think about someone going in and maybe they'll like sort of hit on the bartender a little bit and sort of like see where they get. Does anyone push back against them? No. Okay, cool. I can do this like non-mutual thing here. Great. And they might step up their game and start like cornering someone who's in the bar, you know, and you can see it in body language, like that person is not excited about what's going on. You know, maybe they're like following them around the bar a little bit. So it hasn't reached the point of like physical violence, but they're definitely like following them. They're pursuing this person who's like made it clear that they're not into this advance. And then if no one says anything, right, they get away with that, they'll then sort of like dip their toe in further in and go all the way to abuse and violence. It's not necessarily that methodical, but people test the environment. So if when they test the environment for non-mutual and they are pushed back against, they're not going to try on abusive and violent if they can't even get away with non-mutual in that space. That's how you like stop gateway behaviors, is actually stop them. You know, and it seems straightforward because it is, but we're so not used to doing that. And it does require like getting support of the other people around you. And so that's like one of the things that I think about all the time, is like really like the power map of like, okay, who has power and influence here, and how do I get them on my side if I'm about to intervene, right? Like, how do I make sure if I am sort of pushing someone on harassment and they push back against me, that I can like point to the security guard and he bounces them, right? And like by doing that, you have to be proactive and you have to ask these questions up front. But every venue that I go to on tour, I ask what their sexual harassment, their anti-harassment policies and protocols are beforehand. I ask who the lead person is on their security team who will deal with those things. And then I know and I talk to that person and we build a 30-second relationship. And then if something is done, that is who I call. I have his phone number or, you know, his name on the radio station. And that's who I call when something is done. And he just deals with it. And that is, you know, like, it's partly because that's literally my job on tour, but you can do that as it not being your job on tour, right? Like, you can just be someone who says like, hey, I care a lot about sexual harassment. I don't want it to be done here. I'd like to know what these policies are and who the person on your team is that I can call in if this is happening, because it shows that you're on the same team. It's not overstepping. It's not them. It's not you saying they don't know how to do their job. It's you assuming they do know how to do their job and that you want them on your side, so that if something is done, you know how to deal with it. And those things of like proactively understanding what's in place, who you can talk to, and what you're gonna do, it makes it really seamless when it finally does, like if and when it pops up. it's not that stressful anymore because you know exactly who to call and they know what they're doing and they will deal with it. And if that's not in place, then you talk with your tour manager about that and understand like, okay, this venue doesn't deal with this very well. How are we internally going to deal with it? Who on our team is going to be the person that we call in? That like if the venue, and that, you know, we make sure that person is there present with venue security or festival security because they've made it clear that they're sort of dismissive of this issue, but we are not. So how do we do that? So those are the things that like they feel big sometimes, but it actually isn't. If you are on a tour that like backs you, it doesn't have to be a huge undertaking. You don't have to become a sexual violence expert. You can ask in the tour, like advancing that, add that one extra question. And then you just know who your point of contact is, take the 30 seconds to meet them beforehand. And hopefully you won't have to talk to them for the rest of the night. But if you do, you know, you're gonna have that back. And so those are the things you can do to start thinking about not being so alone in this and being the one person on, you know, your tour and your crew or wherever you are in your venue that cares about this. And really build that, like, even if it's just one other person, you're not alone in it and they can help you in that moment to deal with whatever situation comes up. So we've made it through all of the questions that you all sent in. So thanks for everyone's patience and attention through this seminar. I know it's hard to like just get information and not actually interact with it. So if there are other questions or people have anything else they want to ask or share, now is your time. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up. Wonderful. So Carrie dropped some resources in the chat, so make sure to take a look at that. And really do check out colonialcrows.org. We have a Here for the Music page. You can also go to hereforthemusic.org. It will redirect you there. And we do have some resources there. Like I said, we're coming out with a pledge campaign like next week that you can encourage the groups that you work with, whether you're an employer or you are part of a company or you just have relationships, you know, encourage them to sign on to that. And this is part of the culture change work so that we don't have to come up against these individual questions about being blacklisted or, you know, worrying about like your boss. Like if we can really get companies and venues and festivals to take this more seriously, it takes a lot of the pressure off of us as individuals to find a place that will like treat us, you know, like humans who deserve safety in their workplace. So we're working on it. I'm glad that all the people on this call are in this fight as well. And you can reach out to me at kim@colonialcrows.org if you have questions. So thanks everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.